Welcome
Hello,
to our
everyone.
webinar, Development and Socialization. I'm Isabel Medina and my partner.
My name is Chung.
For today, we will be discussing development and socialization with this content. We will be discussing sensitive periods, cultural differences in psychological processes, differences in early childhood experiences in terms of infants' personal space.
And next, we move to the called developmental transition, socialization to education. And that's all.
For this presentation, our main question is, how does culture shape us? So how does it shape us into who we are
We
and
have to
what we
define
do?
first.
What is development and socialization? So development is basically the changes in our physical, psychological, and social behavior as we experience it from birth until across the lifespan. So basically, it's how we grow up, the process of growing up from the lifespan. Cross-cultural human development, this only means that there are similarities and differences in the way we progress through our development. So across culture, of course, there is a set of processes that we have to go through, but different cultures experience it in different ways. So, on the other hand, socialization is the process by which we become members of a particular culture. So, socialization is actually how we acquire culture. So, if you remember our question earlier, how does culture shape us? The answer is socialization. So, socialization is important in our development and in acquiring culture. So, let's establish the fact that we are born cultureless. So, unlike animals who are born with the innate capabilities of like hunting right after they're born, we human beings don't have that. So we have to learn cultural knowledge, or cultural knowledge is information or of how we can adapt and survive the environment. So we have to learn cultural knowledge because essentially what differentiates us human beings from animals and other creatures is that our brain is capable of acquiring cultural knowledge. That's why we can reason things out, we can think of solutions, think of ways in which we can survive. So that's what keeps us separate from other creatures. So as human beings, because that's essentially what separates us from different creatures, it is understandable that our brains and our biological processes are essentially the same. Although we have differences in probably how we look and think, the main part in which we are the same is that our brain is capable of acquiring culture. So that is what we will consider as a universal brain. So, as I said, we are born cultureless, but we can learn culture. So, by this brain that is capable of acquiring culture, we learn to adjust and seize meaning from our environment. So this is best explained in this quote by Clifford Geertz, who is a cultural anthropologist. He says that one of the most significant facts about humanity may finally be that we all begin with the natural equipment to live 1,000 kinds of life, but end in the end having lived only one. So basically, this means that our brain, how powerful it is, we can live so many kinds of lives. And this is universal among human beings because this is what separates us from other animals. But because of culture, we end living different lives. We end having culturally variable minds. So let's move on. So I said that we acquire culture through socialization. How? How does that happen? And why is this important? So you will see the power of socialization in acquisition of culture through the next presentations. So with the first important explanation of why culture socialization is important in culture is this idea of sensitive periods. So sensitive periods basically means that there is a period of time that allows for relatively easy acquisition of skills. So across development, there are many different kinds of sensitive periods, but we will only discuss sensitive periods for language acquisition and acquiring culture. I will discuss the different kinds of sensitive periods in terms of language acquisition and culture acquisition. Why do we have to focus on these two? First of all, language and culture are very much intertwined because language and culture are both meaning systems that we create to adapt. Meaning systems basically means that through language and through culture, we get to acquire or make sense of our environment or the things that's happening around us. So, first of all, language acquisition. Language acquisition says that we are born capable of acquiring or recognizing sounds. But how do we grow up into distinguishing what is language and what is noise? So it is said that we can learn language by categorically distinguishing the sounds that we hear in terms of the language that we are grown up into. So, for example, if you were born within a Filipino household, you will learn the different phonemes or the different ways the sounds are categorized in the Filipino language. So, as it is understandable, other languages, for example, Vietnamese, categorize their sounds very differently. So, our experiences as a child growing up in a certain culture that categorize these sounds in this specific way, we learn that certain way of language or that certain way of speaking or talking or categorizing sounds. By that, our brains adapt to that categorization and learn to filter out the noise or the things that don't make sense in our language. As I've said, language and culture are very much intertwined. So, much like language, culture is easier to be acquired during the early ages in life. What's different from culture and language is that culture is far less tangible to study. In language, you have words, you can quantify the sensitive period and how different cultures are able to recognize sounds and language. But in culture, it's much more different. But we can see here through, for example, OFWs or overseas Filipino workers. A lot of families migrate to, for example, USA. They migrated to different countries, and then we can see how differently the family members acquire a certain culture. Because culture has a sensitive period at around age 15, those 15 and younger tend to acquire culture much easier than the older ones. So if you will see, if your family migrated to United States and then you were only 5 around that time, it's easier for you to identify with that new culture. For example, USA, it's easier for you to acquire their accent, the way they speak, their culture. In essence, but older adults who migrated, for example, at around age 40, it's harder for them to identify with that culture, and there's this feeling of attachment still to your primary culture. So again, basically sensitive period is saying that language acquisition and acquisition of culture is much more easily acquired when we are younger. So now there is a sensitive period for culture and language. What do you think would happen if we grew up with no socialization at all? Remember that socialization is how we acquire culture. So now let's watch this short clip.
Social isolation affects our emotional and cognitive development a lot. To get a glimpse into how and why this is, let's go to the thought bubble to look at sociologist Kingsley Davis's case studies on Anna. In the winter of 1938, a social worker investigated a report of child neglect on a small Pennsylvania farm and found, hidden in a storage shed, a 5-year-old girl. That 5-year-old girl was Anna. She was unwanted by the family she was born into and was passed from house to house among neighbors and strangers for the first 6 months of her life. Eventually, she ended up being kept in a shed with no human contact other than to receive food. Kingsley Davis observed Anna for years after her rescue and wrote about the effects of this upbringing on her development. When Anna was first rescued, she was unable to speak or smile and was completely unresponsive to human interaction. Even after years of education and medical attention, her mental development at age 8 was less than that of a typical 2-year-old. This is a story with both a sad beginning and a sad ending. Anna died of a blood disorder at the age of 10, and Davis's study of how isolation affects young children was only one of many that have shown how a lack of socialization affects children's ability to develop language skills, social skills, and emotional stability.
As you watch, Anna's case or Anna's story is one of the unfortunate ones that we hear about children who grow up in isolation. So we can see how much her development has been hindered or delayed, and ultimately made it hard for her to reintegrate back into society. So now we move on, cultural differences in psychological processes. So I've mentioned that we acquire culture through socialization. And of course, this acquisition of culture happens across the lifespan. So then it would mean that as we grow older, we acquire more and more culture. So it follows that as we grow older, our differences in the way we think or our psychological processes is more evident as compared as when we were younger. So older adults have more cultural differences in the way they think as compared to children of different cultures, which are much more similar. So for example, Chinese and Canadian 7-year-olds are more similar than 9 and 11-year-olds are, because although Chinese and Canadian cultures are very different, because they are younger, they are more similar than the kids who are older. Because then again, we acquire more culture as we grow up. So, for example, East Asian adults and North American adults differ much more in how they think about the future, because as they have grown older, they have learned different cultures, their minds have had more time to acquire cultures and different kinds of views. Now we move on to the differences in early childhood experiences across cultures. So I've mentioned in language acquisition that our early experiences with language actually affects how we acquire language or how we use language. So our experiences, whether it is physical or interactional with our parents, it also affects our development and how we grow up acquiring different kinds of cultures. So we will discuss how specific cultural practices affect our development in terms of infants' personal space, and then Trung will take over and discuss the parenting styles and noun biases that affect our development. Infants' personal space, Doc Nino asked us to watch this documentary of called Babies. So if you watch it, you will notice the differences in which the babies grew up and how their parents took care of them. So for example, the Mongolian baby was very tightly swaddled, so there was restriction in movement, whereas the Namibian baby was always held by the mother. So you will see the baby, the mother holding the baby at her back while she is working. You will see the difference in the personal space of the Mongolian baby and the Namibian baby, where the Namibian baby almost shares the same personal space as the mother, whereas the Mongolian baby, tightly swaddled, far from the mother, has probably more personal space. Another factor in personal space is bodily contact with the mother. It has been found that European infants were less in contact with their mother, whereas other cultures were almost always held by their mothers. So you will see here the difference in how the babies are able to distinguish themselves just because of the bodily contact. Another factor here is face-to-face contact. So it has been shown that European infants experience more face-to-face contact with their mother. For example, German mothers were more responsive to the cries of the baby or the infant, whereas other cultures were less responsive. This responsiveness and amount of face-to-face contact the baby has with the mother actually predicts how quickly the baby is able to recognize themselves in the mirror. You will see how this bodily contact and face-to-face contact with the mother or the parents actually influence how babies learn to distinguish themselves as distinct beings or separate beings. You will notice if the baby is sharing almost the same personal space with the parents, they are less able to distinguish themselves. Whereas the babies who are tightly swaddled or have their own space or have more face to face contact, they are more able to identify themselves. Another interesting part here is that in Africa, in India, and those countries in Caribbean, the babies experience daily massages and exercises where they are able to stretch the limbs. They were practiced to sit upright. These cultural practices actually facilitate the infant's development. Babies who have these practices are actually able to sit and walk earlier. So, on the other hand, infants who were put to sleep on their backs, there is the inability to crawl, roll over, or stand up. So, you can see how these cultural practices, although it seems very trivial and very simple, it actually helps or impacts how a baby or an infant progresses through their development. There are practices that facilitates the development, and there are practices that actually delays or hinders development. So another factor in helping infants identify their personal space is the idea of co-sleeping and sleeping arrangements. So basically, co-sleeping is the parents sleeping in the same bed or in the same room with their babies or children, whereas sleeping arrangement is how families arrange rooms or assign rooms, who sleeps where, who sleeps with, and so on. Co-sleeping in European or American cultures, we actually value having separate rooms of the mother and the baby and the children. Whereas for the rest of the cultures, especially the Philippines and I suppose Vietnam, co-sleeping is okay and considered as a norm. It's not something frowned upon. But apparently, Americans don't understand much why parents would sleep with their children in the same room or in the same bed. So you will see here the values that cultures place by simply looking at how they sleep. For example, sleeping arrangement for Indians and Americans. Indian parents would tend to value more arranging the sleeping arrangements depending on who needs to be protected and who gets more freedom. So in Indian families, they value protecting the youngest one. So they would prefer one parent to sleep with the youngest one in a room, whereas they also value the boys in the family to have more freedom and have no parents sleeping with them in the room. So you will see what values they place just by looking at the sleeping arrangement. And for Americans, for example, as I've said, they value having a separate room. So you will see that they value the sacred couple, which must have their own room, their privacy, and they value the independence of children by having their own rooms. You will see the parenting decisions, the cultural practices of essentially having body contact, face-to-face contact, co-sleeping, and sleeping arrangement manifests or exposes the values that cultures place on rearing their children. And because of these cultural influences, children learn very different ideas about how to perceive themselves and in relation to others. So I want you to look back before I hand over the presentation to Trong. I want you to look back and try to think, how much personal space did I have or did you have as a child or as an infant? Did you have your own room? Did you sleep with your siblings, your parents? How much contact did you have with your parents or your mother? Now let's move on to Trung.
Hey, thank you, Isabel. Morning, everyone. I think here I will take about the rest of the presentation. Here is different. So let's move on to the next part. Differences in early childhood experience is parenting style. And you can imagine that if you were raised in another family, you have another parenting style to become you will become another person. Okay, so this is for parenting style, and each parenting style we propose up to parental warmth, and one is parental demandingness. Like for example, permissive style provide it's the kind of parents who are undemanding and not controlling, which is they don't have any rules and any goal for their children. At the same time, they accepting almost everything their children want to do. So it's kind of easygoing style parenting. Here is a question for you. Which one of four do you think is the best parental practice? I think none of you choose this one. It's neglecting and uninvolving styles is the worst of the worst parent in the world. Okay. And what is the best parenting style in Western cultures? Obviously, is the authoritative is the best one. But with the non-Western cultural, it seems like authoritarians is more aligned with the social norm where parents seem to be more stricter with their children. Research shows that overly strict and controlling parents in non-Western appear to be associated with increased family cohesion and improved but less happy children. So it's a story about Amy Chua. She's the one of tiger mother, and she have very strict rule with the two daughters. But now when they grow up, now they become successful, and for me, they seem to be happy too. Must this parenting style will affect the children's development? It's definitely right. So in North America, the child will learn how to be independent agent from his mother response. So it's some kind of individualistic cultural. The Chinese children learn how to be reason being, and he needs to respond to his mother other, and this is kind of collectivistic cultural. Indeed, the children think differently when they were very young. So what could be the reason why non-Western parents seem to be strict with their children? My parents were sometimes strict to me, but I appreciate that, especially right now. Another difference in early childhood experience is now bias. What is the now bias? Now bias is the first word that the young children tend to learn. Announced when this phenomenon is everywhere in the world, but it's very clear trend in North America. But however, it's less prominent in East Asia. Why is that so? The first one, there is different in linguistic. In English, usually put at the end of a sentence, which is really is easy to remember. So he get a new car is now, right? But in East Asian and other language, like for example, Korea and Japan, verb can put at the end of the sentence, like Shikuki ate, and ate is the verb, and also the language are allowed to drop the noun and pronouns. Like when you see a baby, same in Vietnam, when you see a baby who can say love instead. Another reason for the difference in now bias is different in communicating about objects is related to the social, cultural. Like in Western, focus directly in the objects. So when you see the picture here, mostly they look at the biggest one. So they will describe the puppy who can play drum. He's white and he have a blue dog, some kind like that. It's very detailed about one dog. East Asian, where the These are the bands of the dog, and they are brothers, and they love each other very much. Some kind like that. So it's focus on the relationships. Now we move on in the different in transition, developmental transitions. Terrible two and adolescent rebellions. Let's see this video and. What are you doing?
The Forte family is like many families across America. Parents Drew and Amy like to take their 2-year-old daughter Sarah on walks in the neighborhood. But a 2-year-old can go from smiles to screams in an instant. Come on. Sarah's right in the middle of what's commonly known as the terrible twos, a time when tantrums are common.
Around age 2 or so, children are really beginning to explore their world. They're learning and they're developing independence. But the problem is they don't really have the vocabulary or the means to express their feelings and so forth.
Idea about terrible twos it seems strange for me because and it's more common among America. The reason why I think is in Asia culture in general, we value the internal relationship, and because of that, I think it's less terrible. About adolescent rebellions, the research show that it's much fewer in culture that tend to be that tend to see control other constraints. The fears is related to the violence, delinquency. So another question for you, compare to your generation, how different is teen rebellion manifest nowadays and why is it so? Okay, and the final part is socialization to education. Education is like you want to go to school because you want to prepare for your future and you want to be fit in your society in the future. So it's some kind of concept of socialization. You fit in the society. Definitely, education is a process of socialization too. Before moving any further into the topic, so this is quiz time. It's very easy one. Okay. In the far north, all bears are white. Novaya Zemlya is in the far north. What color are the bears in Novaya Zemlya? Because it's not a strict question, it's a very easy one. You can answer right away. And you can pause if you want to. All right, and the answer is, white. Okay, white bear. So congratulations for those who answer white because you have some kind of education with you. In an experiment in 1972, the Alexander Gloria, he's the father of the model psychological assessment. So when he asked the people in Uzbekistan about this questions, you should ask those people who like there, not me, because I never be there before. So what is the difference between the one who got education and the one who is not? I think it's different. Something in our brain is different. So the neuroscience has discovered that in our brain we have a cell neuron. This neuron here. The number of neurons is matter, but it's not so important by the connection between them. As you can see here, as your in other ways, the capacity of your brain will determine largely by the number of connections. Your body needs to work out, right? And by working out, you will get more muscle, and so your brain, when you're learning, your brain recruit more connections. So education just doesn't teach you the fact, but it shapes how you think about the work and the way you think about the work in general. So this is the end of the presentation, and I have some summary for all of you to with some main point of our presentations. So the first one, we are born culture free, but however, we begin to socialize with cultural information in very early in our life, and this happens across lifespan. There are cultural differences in our psychological process. We tend to become more and more vulnerable with age. And there is a sensitive period for acquiring language as well as culture in initial years of life. Various cultural practices shape us in every aspect of our life, like how we sleep, how we talk with our parents, and you now and we behave. You can manage this. Cultural differ in child development transitions such as terrible two and adolescent rebellions. And much of socialization of culture happens through education, as we do now, what we learn in lessons, and where there are also cultural differences. Okay, and thank you for all you to listen to us. And even we can say cảm ơn bạn. Okay? Okay.
Salamat.
Salamat.
Thank you for listening.
Okay, and let's watch now what you think on Canvas. Discussion. See you there. See ya. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.